Allison, our guest speaker today. Allison is an instructor of broadcasting and professional communication at Minot State University. Before she joined MSU, she spent more than 20 years in the private sector as an award-winning public relations strategist with expertise in corporate communications, government and media relations, issues in crisis management, employee communications, and event planning. Most recently, she served as a senior communications lead for the Boeing Company in Washington, D.C. From 2006 to 2019, she held various PR management positions in the aviation industry, serving as a primary spokesperson for organizations including JetBlue Airways, Hawaiian Airlines, and Airlines for America. She also currently is president of her own PR strategic communications group, which provides communications and consulting services to national consumer and travel companies. So, Allison, go ahead and take it away.
Sure, great. Well, thank you for the introduction and the kind words. As Jill mentioned, come with a mostly aviation and travel and tourism background. I dipped kind of into the travel industry by luck back in August of 2006. I had spent some time in a consumer PR agency for a while and went into, for a brief time, doing publicity for a hunting and fishing channel called Outdoor Life Network, which is turned into NBC Sports. But I had a moment where I just realized hunting and fishing was not a passion necessarily. And so I was very thankful and happy to land the first job in airlines at JetBlue Airways back then in August of 2006. And as she mentioned, I'm now currently also here at Minot State University as an instructor in the professional communications department and teaching crisis communications as well as social media and journalism. So happy to be here and talk a little bit more about my experience. I know many of you have faced probably your own crises, and I think these types of opportunities are great to just learn from what everybody else has experienced, and hopefully there's some takeaways that you have from some of the backgrounds and incidents that I'll talk about today. Just setting the stage really before I dive in, and clearly, you know, before I joined JetBlue, my focus had been mainly on proactive media relations. I didn't have a lot of necessarily an overview when I was working in the agencies at that time. I was naive and green to crisis and to the airline industry when I joined. And I found out very quickly that that industry in particular is quite prone to crisis events and issues management in general. So when I joined there was a 24/7 crisis hotline that we had set up. Our expectations at that time were to return any of the phone calls from media that were coming in within 30 minutes, regardless of if it was day or night or holidays, and all things that we get in the habit of as PR professionals, and being accessible and quick to build those valuable relationships with the media. And so just setting the stage there a little bit with regards to the two different types of crises that we look at. There's the intentional ones when we're talking about terrorism, sabotage, hostile takeovers, or unethical relationships. Obviously, the 2017 recent incident, Dieselgate with VW, was an intentional, unethical leadership event. There's the Flint water crisis and other things where things are happening knowingly. And I think, if there is a worst in crisis, sometimes these are probably in the worst of the worst category, because you're dealing with a lack of trust and a lack of credibility with leadership. And then there's the unintentional, and this is where a lot of my experience has fallen, and that's, there's no malevolence basically on the intention from leadership but there is potentially poor planning that can lead to problems. Oftentimes these could have been preventable, but for no intention to harm. So this is where, again, like I mentioned, most of my experience has fallen with natural disasters and weather events related to hiccups that can happen, product malfunctions, incidents with customer service fails, particularly with social media. And so I just want to dive in, give you a brief background of the first experience. And that was 6 months into my job at JetBlue Airways. I joined in August of 2006. The event happened on Valentine's Day in 2007. So this was a weather event that was compounded by a lot of operational failures that we could have, looking back on it, fixed in advance. So just for a little history, if nobody knows or is as familiar with the JetBlue brand, it was founded by a man named David Neeleman. He is a brilliant entrepreneur, very focused on servant leadership. He has created several airlines. Prior to creating JetBlue, he created WestJet in Canada. When his non-compete agreement was up with Southwest, he founded JetBlue. This particular incident that I'm talking about now, unfortunately, led to him eventually leaving the company at the request of the board. But once he did that, he left and started Azul Airways in Brazil. And he is now, if you're watching the airline industry, about to start a new airline in the US called Breeze Airways. They're starting by the end of or middle of this summer. So you'll likely see a new airline out there, and this is started by David Neeleman, who started the JetBlue brand. But when we focus on what the JetBlue brand meant, it meant their mission was to bring humanity back to air travel. And so when they started the company, they sat down and they got a whiteboard out and they did what all of the best entrepreneurs start with, is how do you solve for X? What is the worst problem you can do, you can focus on to make something better in the industry. And even at that time, this was the brand started in 2000. And so they were focused on things that what does everybody hate to do in the travel space when they're flying? They have no leg room. There was no entertainment at the time. People were being routed through hub and spoke systems, so there was often many connections. The overbooking, which is still in some airlines, was a problem up until a couple years ago. And all of those things we looked to solve for those problems. So they had the most legroom throughout coach. They were the first airline to put seatback TVs in airplanes. They were a completely egalitarian culture. They now have a first class product, but at the time when they launched, it was just one class of service. And they were focused on customer service, and they set out before they started to live the values. And I still, even today, remember them. I spent 7 years with the company, but their values were safety, caring, integrity, fun, and passion, in that order. And they really set to empower their people. And by empowering their people, they believed that if you treated your people right, that your people would treat the customers right. And that's what they did. They really trusted employees across the board to do the right thing. And if you did the right thing, you were never going to be held. You were never going to be punished for that if you're making a decision that you believe is in the best interest of the customer. And even down to the lingo that we were using, we were serving customers. We weren't serving passengers. And as employees, we were crew members. We weren't employees. And so it was that sense of kind of drinking the blue juice in a way. We were the darlings of the industry at this time. There was a cult following. People wanted to fly us. They wanted to work for us. We were winning all sorts of customer service awards with J.D. Powers. And this is where we set in. And one of the, one of the main other beliefs that we felt people were frustrated with in the industry was that when their flight was delayed, they would prefer their delay to happen rather than their flight to be canceled. We thought they'd rather arrive at their destination than not be able to get there at all. And that's really setting the stage for how we got into hot water. So Valentine's Day, February 14th of 2007, there was a snowstorm that came into New York City. JFK was our main base of operations at the time. And other airlines were already canceling flights. JetBlue was not, because that was not our operating philosophy. We didn't believe that, we thought that there might be windows of opportunity where we would be able to get people out as the snowstorm came in. As it started to blow into New York, we had some planes that were already pushing back because they were going to take off at the last minute and get people to where they wanted to go, beautiful island destinations or warm weather destinations. And as we had a queue, there was a change in the weather that created a mix of freezing rain. And freezing rain is the worst type of weather event to be. You can't fly in freezing rain. It's bad for operations. And as that happened, it literally, as those planes were in queue, the tires of the aircraft started freezing to the tarmac. And these customers were on the planes. There were no buses available to drive out and get them off the plane because it was unsafe conditions. And we didn't properly plan. In the end, we ended up having 10 planes out on the tarmac for close to 9 hours. And hundreds of passengers frustrated. It was an unintentional crisis and weather event exacerbated by some of those things with our operating philosophy that we could have prevented. And it was all the hallmarks of a crisis. It was unexpected. Our leadership was obviously focused on trying to deliver the best for our employees who were starting to get overwhelmed, our shareholders. And at that point, we were starting to fight for the survival of our brand. This is a shot, an image of the actual terminal. The problem with JFK at the time as well is that it was, they've built some beautiful new terminals now, but at the time it was extremely overcrowded, outdated, and it was overflowing, not just with all of the 10 planes that were filled with passengers who were stuck, but also the terminal started overflowing with people who were expecting to go because we hadn't canceled anything. At that point, it was a requirement to have all hands on deck. We had our marketing and sales team members even going out to JFK Airport and working behind the terminals. And at one point, I remember a marketing employee or colleague said that they looked up and it was all marketing employees behind the airport counters because they were trying to get help in order to handle the situation. Pizzas were being thrown in faces of our employees. Our general counsel went out to the airport and jumped up on a table with a bullhorn and just tried to calm people down. This was the chaotic kind of event and experience that we were dealing with. And just to set the landscape a little bit for the media side, this was February of 2007. So Facebook had just been around, I think in the fall of 2006. Nobody was really on Facebook. Twitter was around for about a year at the time. There was, the iPhone had not even been out yet, so nobody had iPhones, but they did have phones that could take photos. And then YouTube had been around at the time for 2 years. So people were there was no social media, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. I often think back, how would this situation have been different? But this was almost the kind of kernel where we watched as our customers were taking photos on their phones and then emailing it to news stations, and they were calling into news stations to be the voice on the ground. And the producers, I remember the initial calls that were coming in, the TV producers were saying, look, we understand weather events happen, but your customers are making this an issue. Your customers are sending us photos and calling and giving us firsthand accounts. So by the night of February 14th, this was now, 12 hours into it. At the end of the day, we had 52 planes on the ground in JFK when we typically should only have 22. So we had 30 extra planes in New York. And what that meant was that our entire system was was unraveling. The planes that were supposed to be in other destinations across the US were now sitting in New York. Our crews were out of place. And when that happens at an airline, it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. You've got to figure out, you know, if you've got planes that are in New York that should be in Florida or California, you now are going to have rolling delays. So we knew at that point that it was not going to be a one-day crisis event. And at this stage, we hadn't set up our emergency operations center. We hadn't set up our crisis plan. And we didn't do that until the following night on Thursday evening. And one thing, you know, that looking back on it was a failure of ours in responding to the crisis, that we waited too long, and that we didn't really realize how deep we were into it or how bad it was, and that we needed that emergency command center open until it was a little bit too late. And the other thing we found was that in crisis, people want to help. This is a passionate brand. There's employees that care, are invested. They want to help. They're invested in the success of the company. But they weren't properly trained. So they didn't know where to go or how to help. And so that was an issue as well in trying to leverage the resources that we had. If we had properly trained people to know ahead of time in the crisis plan what they can do and give them a responsibility, it would have potentially served us better. And I've heard of similar situations where Red Cross and other organizations have had issues where people, again, want to help and send massive amounts of supplies, but there's no logistical operations on the back end to help with that. And so sometimes that can create a secondary incident or crisis, if you will. But on the communications side, you know, we at the time were a very small team. We had a communications team of 5 people. We were doing internal and external communications. We were trying to manage how we were going to respond. There was a lot of, on the leadership side, a lot of discussion and debate about whether we should apologize at all, whether we should say that we're sorry. And in an airline, we had many people from other legacy carriers and other traditional carriers where they strongly believed that this was a weather event. It's no fault of the airlines, and therefore we should not apologize. And that goes against the grain of our values in the sense that other people did feel like we needed to take responsibility and we needed to do it quickly. So we had some debates there. We didn't issue our first press release until late the evening of February 14th. And we did ultimately decide that this is something that we needed to say was unacceptable, and apologize to customers and call that out. I think that, you know, as it was happening, we did start to field media calls. When we look back on it, we had kept media logs and just physically wrote down who was calling from what outlets, what they were asking. We spent days answering media calls. All told, it was about 5,000 that came in over a week-long period. The System Operations Center, when we finally stood up our emergency command on Thursday evening, we kind of were a victim of our own optimism in a way, because our system operations team was telling us that they think that we're going to be reset and they think it's going to improve. And the media were started to cover some hero stories. Obviously, everybody was still angry with us as an airline, but they were covering the hero stories that we had 2 pilots that got in their car, paid money for a taxi to go to a nearby airport where they knew an empty plane was so that they could fly it. And we had other IT employees that were trying to put together e-ticketing for baggage. We had seas of baggage because not only were these people dislocated from where they needed to be, but we also still were left with the baggage and a sea of baggage, not knowing who belonged to which piece. And so that exacerbated things. So as these kind of hero stories were developing of things we were doing to innovate and help, we still were left with not being out of the woods. And so finally on Friday, which was 2 days after the event, our leadership team got together and said, enough is enough. Let's just shut the operation down. And so we took about 1/4 of our flights out. It was a busy President's Day weekend, so it was obviously angering a lot of customers, but it gave us on the communication side the opportunity to finally tell a story, and to finally have a little bit of control and ownership of a story. And so we were really focused on that. We were focusing on our employees were still out of place. They were trying to receive information. Typically, they would receive that from our intranet, from their supervisors directly, or from our blog at the time. But at this point, we were just hoping they would see some of the media coverage to know that we were pulling operations because we were overwhelmed. Looking back on it as well, another failure for us was that our website stayed business as usual. This was the biggest crisis that we had faced at that time. It wasn't an accident or a life-threatening incident, and it wasn't catastrophic. And so in our plan, that's when we would make our website dark, or that was when we would put special messaging up. And looking back on it, we started putting into our communications plan the fact that we need to put in some benchmarks, whether it's not catastrophic, but at what point do you acknowledge publicly on your public-facing website that business is not operations as usual? And we would have pulled that lever a lot sooner, looking back on it. But we felt relief. There was a transparent strategy in place when we finally were able to say something to media and what we were going to do. So moving on to kind of taking control, we were blessed in that we already knew we had the right spokesperson. It's often important, clearly, to make sure that you have the spokesperson that's going to deliver empathy and compassion. And some leaders are brilliant and they run a fabulous organization, but they are not the ones to be out in front of media. And we had the best, most genuine, authentic leader, David Nealman. So he went out and he did provide sincere apologies. Our audiences believed him. We believed him. And so we did some media blitzes. And at this point, he was using a lot of the mea culpa language. He was saying that he was personally humiliated and mortified. And when he was backing up our employees, he was humble in saying, our employees didn't fail us, we failed them, because we had those operational difficulties. And so that apology really went a long way. And we also at that time created something called the Customer Bill of Rights. And so this was a strategy to have David come out and say that we were sorry and here's what we're going to do to fix it. And that also really amplified our message and helped us to rebuild trust and credibility with our customers. So we created this Customer Bill of Rights so that customers knew what to expect if they were to be involved in an incident like this, but in the future. We did talk shows. We did a news release. We placed advertising in some of the local papers in the major cities that we served. And we all pointed to a YouTube video. We had David Nealman go on YouTube and create this customer apology. At the time, again, it was only about 2 years old. We were contacted by YouTube about 12 hours after we posted it, and we thought we were going to be in trouble because we didn't ask for permission to post this video, and we didn't know why they were calling. And they asked if they could feature it on the homepage because this is the first time a brand had used it to do a public apology for that. And that just helped amplify and get the message out there to as many people as we could. And so we also sent emails. So we went to the marketing department and got emails of all the customer emails that we possibly could. And we emailed them the apology with a link to the video as well, all pointing to that. He went on the Today Show, as well as David Letterman at the time. David Letterman was at the end of the day. Our lawyers and legal team did not want us to go on. We had a point where we were considering pulling that that interview, and then we realized we would probably be skewered worse if we had agreed and then pulled out of it. So he did end up doing it. It maybe wasn't the best interview. It was the last day, but he did it, and we were proud that he went out there. At the end of this, so this was a total of a 6-day crisis. And again, it was kind of, it's not over till it's over, because we kind of had these multiple layers of crises involved. I think that, there was a $22 million loss for the company. It was obviously something our shareholders were watching, but the brand equity and the goodwill that we had built up in the beginning before we were in this crisis really went a long way for us to take from that and then rebuild it, and helped us to hold a lot of the customers that we did have. We also used the intranet to send out video messages to our employees at that time, and open up some opportunities for them to ask questions anonymously through comments. And at the end of the day, it was open and honest communication to our shareholders. It was a significant event in the fact that obviously government lawmakers were involved. There was government legislation being discussed to regulate that, ensure that this would never happen again. When you look at what JetBlue did, I think that what they provided was within 1 week, they had a customer bill of rights up, and we felt it was more, broad and more meaningful than anything that government could legislate. Several years later, the DOT did implement the 3-hour tarmac rule, and that's what people see today. If you're stranded, if you're left out on the tarmac of a plane for longer than 3 hours, the Department of Transportation now starts to fine airlines several $1,000s per minute that they're gone from the gate. So this is kind of why they are moving back towards the gate as well. So just a few takeaways again. Obviously, this was my first crisis experience. Looking back on it now, how lucky I was to be part of a communications team in an organization that truly lived its values. That's most important, I think, is to set your values in place. And when a crisis hits, make sure everybody's living those values and making decisions according to those. I think that's what brought us through to the other side and really empowered our team as communicators to make those right decisions, and our employees across the network to get in a cab and get a plane and try and get it to where it needs to be. So doing right by our customers and living those values to make sure that we have a positive reputation with customers, and also having that, vat of goodwill in advance is going to serve a lot as well. And a big takeaway, as I mentioned, define your roles and responsibilities in advance and train people to be able to take advantage of those and drill. And I think some of these, examine all of your communications channels and pull those levers. Know how you can communicate and where your audiences show up so that you can communicate properly and stay true to your brand. I'm just going to go through very quickly. I have a few more, but I realized that was a little bit of a longer overview. This graphic always makes me laugh because it's true, right? If the Titanic sank in 2001, everybody would make sure they documented it before they went and got help, or if they before they communicated anything else. And this is just how differently our world is now, and how that response might have changed. Obviously, the old kind of PR playbook can no longer apply. You can't wait 12 hours to send out your first press release like we did. You have to get out in front of it. Obviously, within seconds, somebody's going to have something out, and your message is already going ahead of you if you don't get out there and at least acknowledge that you're aware something's happening and that you're going to look into it. So the speed of communication is our new reality with that. I was not involved in this particular situation, but I did work for Airlines for America, which goes on behalf of the entire industry to work on regulation and change in the industry. And a perfect example of the speed and the kind of the playbook that we're dealing with today is the United response to Dr. Dow, who was bumped off of a flight in Chicago. He was one of 4 customers. This was in 2017. He refused. Customers filmed it. He was badly injured and dragged off the plane. And I think that, you know, when you think about it from the airline's perspective, my thought was, why would they have not acknowledged the video? And I think that was the most important thing. I can see from their perspective, there are certain policies and procedures in place. Employees are there for safety and security reasons. You often have questions of responsibility and questions of evidence. And the question of responsibility here, I think, is what United was probably also grappling with, because this was a United Express flight. It wasn't their mainline carrier flights, and it wasn't their security that was the one physically dragging the customer off. It was actually airport security that had been called. And so I know I'm assuming questions of whether they apologize blatantly or not. But when you see something that's out there unfolding on video, you have to comment initially on what you see and then investigate further. And that incident, you know, obviously was spawning some government legislation as well. One other event that I dealt with, this was in 2010, and was another example of kind of learning that social media is a valuable tool. This same 5 employees that I mentioned, we were all in the war room together answering calls. One of them popped up one day and said, "I think we have a situation. One of our employees just cursed out a plane load of passengers, grabbed 2 blue moons, pulled the emergency slide, and ran off onto the tarmac." This was kind of a, you can't make this type of event up. You know, our hands were tied from a communications perspective, because in a legal sense, our lawyers didn't want us to say a lot. It was an ongoing investigation. It was about protecting the privacy of our employees, regardless of the events that unfolded. But I guess the question would be, what would you do in this scenario? And again, I think this was the response that we put up on our blog at the time. We were using our blog to post our comments on a lot of things that happened, and we would post that on then a link to our Facebook and our Twitter pages. But this event happened. We were very late to the game here. We waited 2 days before we responded, and that was unacceptable. It took us 2 days to respond then. We would probably again be skewered today for that. But we took an irreverent tone and tried to jump in and say, you know, that we need to separate this rogue employee from our brand. And the best way to do that is to position them as, you know, we all have a bad day sometimes. And this is an event that happened. People thought of him as a folk hero. And so separating ourselves worked well, but we should have probably taken a quicker stance. I think just quickly, the attention that moved off of us, that first blip here was when the event happened. Obviously, there was a ton of commentary here on this bar. We didn't even jump into the conversation until the comments were dying down. The tone was neutral, though. Across, there was obviously some negative and some positive, but largely neutral for our brand. So looking back, did we fail in the response? Maybe. Would we do things differently? Yes. But today, I would say people remember this story in particular, but they don't necessarily connect it to a negative feeling for the brand. And so in that sense, social media is a listening tool, obviously, to know whether things are bubbling up and starting to unfold. You can actually know when the event's going to happen, and know when you might need to jump into the conversation. And one thing most important is to know your stakeholders and determine, you know, the reach of a social media post and whether it's going to hit the right audience. Understand how those stakeholders might communicate. We had an example at Hawaiian Airlines, an outbreak of hepatitis A, where an in-flight crew member had tested positive for the virus. And this was spreading around the islands due to some bad scallops, of all things, that was in a sushi restaurant. And the reason why it was kind of more significant for our flight attendant to test for hepatitis A was that because she and he serve, when they serve food, that means it could potentially transmit to the customer. And so we had to backtrack and find out how many flights did this person work, where did they go, and now we need to communicate to those customers. And we realized it was going to be an incident because the Department of Health called us, and they have a policy that when when an employee at a company tests positive in a situation like this where customers need to be informed, they'll start issuing press releases and serve the media. So our Department of Health was a stakeholder in that they gave us a couple of hours notice, advance notice that this was happening. And we immediately internally had to build a team of what are we going to do in this situation? And it was a big collaboration between our internal stakeholders. We gathered human resources, legal, marketing, our revenue management team, and our communications team to work on this. And our focus was in how we were going to get this out. And ultimately, we worked with marketing to create a special landing page to point customers to where they needed to go with flights that were affected. We got approval from our chief financial officer that we could provide free vaccinations to all of the customers, and then our employees who were concerned that they might be exposed. We used human resources to set up health vendors to get inoculations for them. We made the conscious decision not to post this on social media because it was a limited amount of affected area. It was in the Hawaiian Islands and these 3 particular flights. And we were able to communicate with those customers that were affected directly through email and using our customer service agents to contact them. So public facing, we did have a landing page. We did have our chief financial officer talk to the local media outlets, but we chose intently not to use social media in that instance. And that was a key stakeholder as well. And then just lastly, I know we're getting close to, do we have the full hour, Jill?
Yes, we should have a full hour.
Okay, great, perfect. Just one more example of knowing your stakeholders and kind of some of the ways in which that can benefit you. Another can't make this event up, can't predict for this event, can't plan for this event, just have to follow the playbook. In 2014 on Easter Sunday, I received a phone call that said that somebody had fallen out of the wheel well of one of our aircraft on Maui. And the flight had come from San Jose, California. So this was a 5.5, 6 hour flight over the Pacific Ocean. And the call from system operations was saying this. And my first instinct was, no way, this isn't possible. This is a hoax, or there's misinformation. I don't think this is something that could be true. But I did, I think I immediately Googled how many times has this even happened? And, it had happened very few times, only about a quarter of people who have flown in the wheel well of an aircraft where there's no heat, no oxygen. They have lived, but how are we responding to this, and what do we do next? My first steps, I happened to be in the middle of developing a crisis communication plan at that time, and I was going through and listing all of the contacts that I think we might need to know at every destination. And I had a few months prior reached out to the airport PR person for San Jose Airport. And this happened to be where this aircraft had come from. And at that time, it was more of an introduction. Hey, just wanted to say hello. We're in the communications department. We serve your airport. Great to get to know you, if there's anything we can do. But we built that initial line of communication to get to know one another before the incident hit, so that when this event occurred, I immediately knew, I've got to call Rosemary. She's the PR person in San Jose, and she's dealing probably with similar questions from media, because there's a question of how did this person jump over and breach the airport security fence and climb into the wheel well. And who else is involved? Thinking about the FAA is involved. The FBI was involved because it's a 16-year-old boy who ended up flying out, and so domestic child services was involved. And so it was thinking about kind of how we all were collectively responding to an incident that we all had a stake in. And you know, what would our statement say? I think another stakeholder we thought about was Boeing. The manufacturer of the aircraft might get calls because they might want to know plans, where physically does a person sit within a wheel well of an aircraft, and so we all work together. Ultimately, in certain situations, that one entity is going to take more responsibility, and that in this case was the FBI kind of took lead on this. But we needed to say something, and this is our statement that we really had the opportunity to say. At this point, we didn't have much else to say. We were all kind of dumbfounded that this incident was occurring, but he was exceptionally lucky to have survived. But having that phone tree in advance and knowing who to contact in advance, rather than spending valuable time trying to research who I might need to reach, it was incredibly valuable to save time. And of course, you probably are going to end up cold calling people as well when you realize someone's a stakeholder you haven't reached out to before. But that's certainly something that I thought benefited us in this instance. And the other part of this that really rose to the top for us was social media policy and procedure. This is something you need to have in place. Don't forget one of your most important stakeholders are your employees. And so how do you expect that your employees show up every day on social media and also when in crisis? And so having that social media and policy in place will allow people to understand where your brand stands. In this instance with the stowaway, we had previously outlined that when crew members use social media and represent themselves, when they're in the workplace, they're also representing the brand. And so in that instance, we do have some control over what they're posting. And we particularly said in times of crisis, there should be no social media posts. One of the baggage handlers who found the boy who had fallen out of the wheel well ended up snapping a photo of the wheel well itself, and there was a kind of a dusty print of his footprint that he had posted, and he posted that to his personal social media pages. It went viral a lot for the media that was interested in it, and the media started contacting him directly, which is something from a communication standpoint we were trying to prevent from happening. And so there was some discussion with HR and that employee about the fact that they violated the policy, and that was important to have in place prior. And on the flip side of that, and this is where we were still kind of diving in and trying to figure out the flip side of employees behind customer service counters, particularly in airlines, in the airline industry, often run into customer service issues, and audiences, customers are, holding their phones up to their face and they're mad and angry, and it's an escalating situation. And our employees were coming to us asking, what protections do they have? Where are their legal rights? Or on the flip side, and this is what we found, we did find that from a legal standpoint, in the public space, unless they're physically threatened, that customers or other people can film you and post that on social media. And so we needed to then implement a training solution to teach our crew members and our employees how to handle those types of situations, so that they could handle them properly and de-escalate, even though they knew they were being live streamed. And that was something that still is being developed. And so lastly, I would just a couple of slides to say, when a crisis hits, it can often fall into that can't make this stuff up category. And so while you never are going to be able to know what's going to hit you, obviously, just planning and thinking about brainstorming all the different vulnerabilities that you might have as an organization or that you might encounter is the best strategy to do, is to have a plan and begin thinking about all the what ifs, build your up-to-date emergency contact list and don't just build it and leave it and walk away. Constantly call people, move around. So we were constantly re-updating our contact lists every year. And adding in those guidances on what to do with social media and with your internal plan as well. And so, you know, we collaborated with our competitors in the airline industry. We say we never compete on safety. And so we were constantly learning from each other about how to prepare for a crisis. And we were also attending industry events with the National Transportation Safety Board or others, allowing them to teach us more about what would happen in that situation. I would spend any time a crisis event happened with another organization, whether it was in the industry or a notable event, sit down for 30 minutes and have a conversation about what that brand did well and what they could have done to improve, and then pull out your plan and start writing in what you really like so that next time those things would be in the plan. And so that's really, you know, kind of a quick overview. I hope that that helped kind of give some lessons learned as well. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or there's a raise hand feature too. If I notice that you raise your hand, I can call on you. Just to get started though, Allison, can you tell us about how much drilling the employees actually had to do on crisis situations so that you would be prepared enough? Was it once a year? Was it more often than that? What kind of drilling?
Yes. So at the airlines, it was typically once a quarter. And so that meant you were really doing a kind of a mock situation. We would all get a notification on our phones that said drill, drill, drill. And then whatever responsibility you had, you would pull your plan out. These were always surprise days. We didn't know when it would happen. So we weren't preparing to come in next Thursday for a drill. We were just surprised by it so that we could truly enact how it might be in a real situation. And then we would have one major enactment where there would be a lot of other, you know, events where there might be injured people showing up, or media showing up at the door outside the headquarters, and how to deal with that. And so I think at minimum twice a year would be a great, if not at least once a year, would be a great timeline.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions they want to post in the chat? Any comments?
And I'll say too, with the drilling, I think, you know, that's where a lot of the vulnerabilities pop up too. Sometimes I remember the first time I sat down in a drill, I knew immediately or instinctively I needed to grab something, and I turned around and it hadn't been created yet, or it wasn't there. And this is the crisis plan is always an obviously evergreen plan. You know, you just constantly build on it and constantly add to it. So.
Have you had to use a plan that you discovered worked really well, that you did have all your ducks in a row?
I think that the incident I talked about with just the phone tree was extremely valuable. I wouldn't say that I've ever experienced an event where it went flawlessly. There's always something to take away, definitely. But at least having kind of that foundation helped tremendously. And another thing is having some pre-written templates that you've talked through with your legal team or your marketing team, so they know in some case what direction you might head has been valuable as well, because having those pre-conversations with your internal stakeholders helps them feel like they have been involved and have had the conversation, and they feel more comfortable to go more quickly when a situation hits.
You had mentioned employees and making sure that they're protected and that they understand how the communication is going to go. when something doesn't go quite right, like the employee who posted the picture and it went viral, did you have policies in place then that there was action you could take against that employee, or did you learn that there needed to be something?
We had a policy in place at that time on action to take against the employee. And so there was reprimand for that, and it was written in the policy. But what we realized we didn't have was supporting them as well. It's a two-way street. They shouldn't necessarily be posting about the brand, particularly in crisis. And we need to support them in crisis with social media and how we do that.
Okay, there's a couple of questions on our chat. One is, any follow-up on the boy who fell from the plane? Surely they did some studies on his health to figure out how he survived.
So there had been, I think, from the airline perspective, we didn't kind of follow up on that, but from a personal interest, I have watched some of the stories develop. They talk about being in a state of kind of suspended animation with regards to being able to survive something like that. When the aircraft landed, it was actually several hours before he came out of the wheel well, and that's because he was somewhat thawing out from the event. But with regards to how he is now and how his health is now, I'm not sure. It did end up being a pretty tragic kind of international story that had developed. There were questions of why he jumped onto our aircraft. A 16-year-old boy, he was searching for his mom, who at the time he had thought that his mom was in what had been killed in a bomb attack in Mogadishu. His father had told him that she had died, and he found out that she hadn't, and was escaping to try and get to the airport to get to his mother. And for whatever reason, whether it was the image of our tail fin, he thought it might be going to the direction he wanted to go, but that there was, between health issues and also just mental health issues too, the Child Protective Services was quite involved too. But
yeah, another question is whether there were any medical emergencies when the planes were grounded on the tarmac for 9 hours. But those,
thankfully, there were not, but certainly could have happened. There were, obviously young children and people that needed insulin or had things checked, that medicines in the checked luggage that they couldn't get to. Thankfully, there were no significant medical incidents. I think if there was, we would have at that point had to have figured out a way to drive a bus out onto the tarmac, and then more people would have wanted to get off with the injured person, or with the sick person for sure, because they were at their wits' end. And this isn't, this was 2007, and it certainly has not been the last time that something like this has happened in the industry, where customers have unfortunately been stranded for longer than they need to be. But with regards to I couldn't have survived. Yeah, your emotions run high at that point. So I think I heard stories of flight attendants letting children push carts up and down the aisles, and plug phones in when at that time we didn't have plugs at every seat, but some of the luxuries we have now with traveling. But
okay, well, those are the questions we had. And since our time is about up, I guess we'll get ready to sign off. But we thank you again, Allison, for joining us. And it was interesting hearing your stories.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, and thank you to everyone who came.